Olá, tudo bem? Bem-vindo ao novo episódio da minha programa aqui no 247. Esta semana, extraordinariamente, eu não vou apresentar notícias legendadas do emissora norte-americano The Real News, pois semana passada o Glenn Greenwald apareceu num programa de rádio muito popular do Nova York chamado The Michael Brooks Show. E Michael, além de transmitir o programa no rádio, ele sempre transmite no YouTube também. Então eu perguntei a ele se a gente podia pegar essa entrevista com Greenwald, em que ele fala muitas coisas interessantes sobre os vazamentos. Brooks é uma figura que vem trabalhando muito no movimento internacional Lula Livre para o último ano. Cada semana ele passa muito tempo falando sobre o caso. Então eu achei que as perguntas que ele fez foram muito interessantes e até em alguns momentos ele rebate um pouco com Greenwald sobre a conjuntura brasileira. Espero que vocês gostem e um abraço para todos e todas de vocês.
And joining us now is Glenn Greenwald. He's the co-founder of The Intercept, journalist. Sure you know who he is. He's also the co-author of this massive story that we're going to be talking about today. Glenn, thanks so much for being back.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
So, Glenn, obviously, you know that I've sort of taken to this story in terms of Lula's imprisonment. I've always seen him as a political prisoner. I think there was a lot of reasons just sort of analytically to see potential U.S. influence there, the dynamics in Brazil, and also I think you and I in some ways, might have some interesting disagreements about Lula and PT, but recognized also that Lula really is a distinctly sort of important progressive political communicator in modern politics. So there was this many potential international dimensions to it. But this report really sort of fills in a lot of detail on the speculation that this Lava Jato team were, not clean players to say the least. Can you center us first by saying what these leaks are, where they came from, and what, I guess, basically the main takeaways are before we go into different parts of the detail?
Sure. So Brazil, of course, is undoubtedly, your audience knows, has been through huge numbers of political crises, including the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016 and the ascension of Jair Bolsonaro, a previously unthinkably extremist figure, in 2018. Corruption scandals, political scandals, economic crises, epidemic of violence. But by far the biggest event and the most important event was the imprisonment of former President Lula da Silva in 2018, in part because he is one of the gigantic figures on the world stage when it comes to world leaders. He was elected overwhelmingly in 2002 and 2006 and left office with a 87% approval rating, brought millions of people out of poverty, transformed Brazil into a country of the future for the first time. I mean, it's hard to find somebody that surpasses his stature. So imprisoning him just for that reason alone is already an earth-shattering event, but it was so much more important because he was planning to run, and in fact was running again for president in 2018. He was term limited out of office in 2010, and all polls showed for a full year that he was not just the front runner, but the overwhelming favorite to win the election. And so you have this task force of prosecutors in Brazil called Lava Jato. In English, it means car wash, led by this judge, Sergio Moro, who have been putting huge numbers of people in prison with the clear goal of trying to get ultimately to Lula. And they prosecuted him in a very dubious way. You and I have talked about this before. I'm sure you've talked about this with other people. And that prosecution of him, that conviction of him by Judge Moro in 2018, once it was affirmed by an appellate court with remarkable and bizarre speed, meant that Lula was ineligible to run for president. So it not only put one of the most important world leaders in prison, but it took the front runner, the overwhelming favorite to be the next president, out of the running. It rendered him ineligible to run under the law, which paved the way for Bolsonaro's victory And then as soon as Bolsonaro won, he turned around and rewarded the judge who convicted Lula, Sergio Moro, by creating this new super justice ministry position where Sergio Moro, has unparalleled powers. And it was an obvious, at least the perception was a quid pro quo. What makes the leak so significant, the archive that was provided to us by our source, is that there have been all kinds of leaks used by the prosecutorial task force in Judge Moro. They constantly leak to the press accusations that were unverifiable and instantly destroyed the reputation of whoever reputation they wanted to destroy by leaking to Globo that so-and-so was accused of stealing or receiving a bribe. But there was almost no reporting about the prosecutors and the judge themselves. What were they doing? What were they saying internally? What were they plotting? The media turned them into these kind of deity figures, these superheroes that couldn't be questioned. And the archive that our source provided is this gigantic archive of all of their internal discussions, all of their internal emails and audios and videos and documents that enable us for the first time to take a look at what they were doing during the time that they were essentially radically transforming Brazil using the force of law.
So right, and so and again, just and to reiterate, right? So the sort of the perspective that PT has put forward and Lula has put forward, and I've echoed and have made disseminated, and I would say another site in addition to the reporting that you and the Intercept have done all along. There's an excellent independent site called Brazil Wire.
Yeah, Brazil Wire. Yeah,
Indispensable and Brian Mayer, which we've relied on a lot, who've always sort of like. Again, as I said, just analytically, you can put together what was on the public record, which are these enormously questionable things. Now, what has Lava Jato's public stance been in terms of their lack of a political bias? And first, let's talk about the team's specific reaction after they had already jailed Lula and removed him from the race. So these radical steps already taken. We'll get to that and what those charges were, what they were saying about that in private context, but them attempting to block him from even getting an interview, which of course he did not get, would seem to run in the face of their kind of public protest, sort of public protests that they're non-biased sources. So what happened with Lula getting access to an interview in the last stages of the last year's presidential campaign?
Well, so this was, always the remarkable thing is that not only was Lula put into prison, but he was basically held incommunicado. So Lula is, I've interviewed him twice now, and there's just nobody who is a more charismatic communicator than he is. I mean, you go into an interview with him ready to challenge him, and within 2 minutes you feel hypnotized. Like you have to remind yourself you're not there to like him, you're there to question him. He has this like magnetism and charisma that I don't really think I've ever seen any other political leader possess. And so they obviously were, the elites of Brazil and the center and the center right have been trying for 16 years to defeat PT on the ballot box, and they just got crushed over and over because of the singular force of Lula. So they were petrified that if he was allowed to speak to the public in prison in the form of an interview, that he could single-handedly sway the election to PT. They thought this was their big chance to get rid of PT once and for all, right? They couldn't do it 4 times in a row. They lost 4 elections to PT, twice to Lula, twice to Dilma. They impeached Dilma. They finally got PT out of power. So this is going to be the first election since taking Dilma out of power, and they were petrified that all of those efforts were going to go to naught because Lula was just going to waltz back into the presidency. And so, or once Lula was imprisoned and rendered ineligible, that his chosen successor, who was Fernando Haddad, a kind of young, technocratic, one-term mayor of São Paulo, the one who Lula decided should be the PT candidate once Lula was rendered eligible, that Lula would have the power to basically cause Haddad to win the election by just communicating in the way that he communicates. So several media outlets, Folha of São Paulo, which is the largest newspaper in the country, but also The Intercept Brazil and me personally, spent 2018 petitioning the court to be able to interview Lula so that the public could hear from the former president about politics, about the 2018 race, about Bolsonaro, about Haddad. And it wasn't Lula asking for it because prisoners don't have a right to be interviewed. It was us, the press, asking for it on the ground that the right of the free press guarantees us the right to have access to him. And finally, about 2 weeks before the election, a particular member of the Supreme Court who's renowned for kind of being a courageous dissenter granted the petition of Folia and one of the most influential journalists in the country who's great, Monica Bergamo, the right to interview Lula in prison. And they were all ready to do it. And what our leak show, or the leak documents show, and it's one of the stories that we were able to report, is that immediately upon learning that a justice of the Supreme Court had authorized Lula to be interviewed by Folia 12 days before the election, these supposedly apolitical, neutral, non-ideological prosecutors exploded in a rage and in a panic and spent all day plotting on how they could subvert or undermine or block the judicial order. They considered really unethical things like telling the federal police to purposely schedule it after the election and then claim that since there was no date in the order that they complied. They were thinking about themselves petitioning to allow every prisoner to be interviewed, so they would just turn it into a circus and dilute his interview. They were thinking about forcing other reporters in, so it was a press conference and not a one-on-one interview, which would further dilute it. It was all like they all looked like political operatives talking about how to dilute the political impact of Lula. But the most incriminating part was on several occasions, they openly admitted that their goal, that their motive in blocking the interview of Lula wasn't some sort of principled stance that prisoners shouldn't be interviewed because, as the judge pointed out, the most dangerous prisoners in Brazil are routinely interviewed. The leaders of drug gangs, murderers, rapists. Their goal, they said, the fear that they had was that an interview with Lula, in their words, would help elect Haddad and would allow the return of PT to power. And the chief of the car wash task force, who has spent 5 years righteously insisting that he has no politics, he doesn't care about any party, he doesn't care about any ideology, he's only devoted to fighting corruption, said to one of his best friends, who's also a prosecutor, "Let us pray that today's events don't usher in the return of PT to power." So everything they've been denying for years, that people have been suspecting but couldn't prove, namely that they are vehemently opposed to PT on political grounds and have been using their prosecutorial powers in pursuit of that ideological agenda, was proven by the documents which we thus far have published.
Another shocking revelation in the documents, which again was already there, at least just in terms of the kind of profound weakness of the case. And maybe I'd also like to weave in a little bit of media critique of this too. If you read a report, from the Washington Post or the Guardian or the New York Times, they'll regularly say, sometimes they'll use more vague terms like graft, which, again, you're more sort of technically safe to say that that is indeed what happened, and then you can get into the merits of the case or not. But they'll actually, use like corruption, charges related to Lava Jato or money laundering, when the actual case that was sped through and what Lula was put in jail for always seemed, just even what we had in the public record, to be incredibly threadbare. I'd like you to re-review that case. And then these documents also show that, we weren't the only ones who thought that this case might be sort of like shockingly weak.
Right. It's funny because it reminds me so much in so many ways, but including in the way that you just asked me about of the Snowden case. Because, there were a lot of us who for a long time believed the NSA was mass spying in a shocking, lawless way, in an indiscriminate way on the internet.
Right.
But we couldn't really prove it. So when we would say it, people would say you're crazy conspiracy theorists. And so when I finally got my hands on this massive archive that proved they were doing exactly that, so many people to this day, people say, I finally felt vindicated that I could actually see the evidence and that I wasn't crazy the way people were saying. And that's what these documents are starting to do, that people who have been accused of being conspiracy theorists by saying car wash is about destroying PT and preventing Lula's return, that they're fabricating these charges, knowing that they're weak. These documents just completely vindicate all of those claims. And in the case of Lula's conviction, you and I talked about this the last time, and this is maybe one of the areas where we do have a little bit of a difference. I'm not sure, though, is, there are a lot of very grand charges against Lula that he, as the task force called him in a press conference, was the commandancy, or the commander of the entire corruption scheme that ran Brazil for years, and that he has accepted millions of dollars in bribes and all of these grandiose charges, none of which have been brought into court because they're very complicated, difficult to prove charges. There was always this tiny little case that they brought that nobody ever even paid attention to because it was so trivial and so obviously dubious, where they claimed that Lula had received this, what they call a triplex, because they try and make it seem like it's this beautiful, expensive palace like Queen Elizabeth lives in.
Right.
But in reality, it's just like shitty, grubby, like disgusting, very just kind of like mediocre apartment that Lula could buy 500,000 times over if he wanted. So they claim that he received this apartment and renovations to it in exchange for him using his contacts in Africa and elsewhere to get contracts for the construction company that owned it. And the problem was, and it was a pretty big problem, there were no documents that ever showed that Lula was actually the owner of this apartment, that he had anything to do with the apartment even. So how do you convict somebody in a court for having received an apartment as a bribe when there's literally no evidence that they're the owners of the apartment?
Right.
And there was a very big problem beyond that, which is that the only way that this car wash task force and Judge Moro had a right to prosecute Lula, since they're in Curitiba, which is a city in central Brazil, and he lives in São Paulo, was if they could prove that it had a nexus to Petrobras, which it just on its face it never did, because it was a different construction company that they were that they were alleging had given him this apartment. So they were claiming in public and then claimed in court that this was an incredibly rock solid case. And everybody was always confounded, even the people who hate Lula and believe he's corrupt, that they brought this case first, because everybody was saying this is small stakes. And it's the weakest one of your cases because you have no evidence that he's the owner. But the reason they brought it first was precisely because it was such a simple case. It was one quick transaction. We give you this apartment and renovations on it in exchange for contracts that you help us get. And the reason they were so eager to bring a simple case was because the real goal, as we just discussed, was to convict him so quickly and then affirm the conviction on appeal in time to prevent him from running and winning the 2018 election, which none of the other more complicated cases would have allowed. So,
and the lead prosecutor says in these leaks, like there is, I mean, I can't quote it verbatim, but basically something to the effect of, "Are we sure about this one? How does this relate to our mandate? This seems pretty weak," sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So that's what these leaks, I mean, everybody always knew this case was dubious.
Right.
But what's amazing about these leaks is that not only did the prosecutors, who of course in public were saying the evidence is overwhelming, the evidence is irrefutable, the evidence is undeniable, not only were they saying internally, we think the evidence is incredibly weak, we're not even sure we have a case against him. And I'm not talking about early on, I'm talking about like 3 days before they indicted him.
Yep.
They were saying internally they don't think the evidence is sufficient either to prove that he was the owner of this apartment or to demonstrate that they had the right to prosecute him because they didn't have the jurisdiction for it. And it's amazing how it's not, just the kind of last minute questions that you ask yourself,
right.
like, hey guys,
right.
sure this case is really as strong as we think. It was them saying, the evidence just isn't here. And yet they brought the case anyway because they knew that they had a judge in Sergio Moro who was going to convict Lula no matter what, because that was his principal goal, and because, as these documents also reveal, and this is probably the biggest part of the story, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about next, Judge Mora was collaborating with the prosecutors all along on how to construct the case against Lula.
Well, I did want to get to that in a second. I just wanted to spell because you said there might be a disagreement. And I think that's actually interesting because I guess my two thoughts, and one thought is much more just sort of simplistic but I think it's worth exploring. And the others maybe a bigger argument here about how we even use and define things about like corruption and I'll get to the second more interesting point first. I'd be curious your feedback on both. One part of it does occur to me that this amount of resource and energy, finances, media support, political support, basically total judicial impunity, which, as you said, we'll get to the most even more explosive things in a minute, that if that tangibly only yields this charge, and I guess, yes, of course, some of these cases are complex, I don't know. That to me is still pretty revealing. I mean, there's plenty of other Brazilian politicians, including ones at the top level, who, there's tape of them, ordering a bribe. There's a lot of much more clear evidence than there ever was with Lula for these more grand, accusations. And it does seem to me that if they're willing to do this from all of our revelations, all the revelations of your work, that it's pretty plausible that doing a PowerPoint where you sort of can, basically imply that Lula is some sort of like Stalinist drug cartel head would sort of fit a pattern of, political warfare or lawfare. That's actually, take that one first, because the second point is actually, believe it or not, more broad than that. But, that's my kind of basic strong skepticism.
I guess like my only issue is, I guess, and I'm not sure that we even do disagree, but I mean, I guess. So just to be clear, there are other cases that they have brought against Lula. He's been indicted for multiple other more serious crimes, but none of them have made it to court. None of them have even gotten close to court because they convicted him on this. And so there's really, he's 72 years old. He has a 10-year prison sentence. There's not a lot of motivation to try and prove these bigger, broader charges. So it's not like they didn't bring the case. They have charged him with these broader crimes. I'm just not willing to declare definitively that I view Lula as being free of corruption. Because the reality is that the entire political system of Brazil has been run on corruption. In the U.S., when you talk about corruption, it's usually this Congress member got caught taking a bribe, or like this, lobbyist did something untoward. There's isolated cases of corruption. I would go even further and say the entire system is sort of legalized corruption, which is what lobbying really is. But in Brazil, it's much different. It's like for decades, the way it's worked is if you want a contract with the government, you pay millions of dollars to politicians, senators, governors, presidents, and they just stick it in Swiss bank accounts, and then they give you the contract. That's the way. It's just
this is my
worked.
This is actually sorry. Go ahead.
So I tell you, just like and PT has been the head of the government for 14 years, and there's undoubtedly people in PT, as Lula himself has said to me when I interviewed him, who are genuinely corrupt. So I'm not one of these people who is pounding the table saying, I know for certain Lula was not involved in corruption. What I will say, though, for sure, is that I've never seen evidence of his corruption. And obviously, you should not put someone in prison nor declare them corrupt absent concrete evidence that it's true. And there just isn't any thus far presented when it comes to Lula, in contrast, as you said, to, for example, the president who preceded Bolsonaro, who engineered the coup against Dilma, Michel Temer, who literally got caught on tape ordering bribes to be paid to silence witnesses. So it is significant.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that to me is significant, and I've threaded this, on the show, and I think been pretty open about it. And again, this, any avenue you go, if you're being rigorous, is going to lead to some potential big pitfalls and dangerous outcomes. So I think everything you just said, absolutely. And I've tried to cover the story in a way that, as an example, even re-engineers, I obviously I have huge admiration and support for Lula, and I do think he's a political prisoner. But, when Lula first came to power in 2002 or 2003, and the coverage of him in the States was, here's this radical who's sort of like learned how to like tame and work within the system. To me, obviously they're emphasizing a willingness to sort of play by certain macroeconomic rules, but that also meant making peace with just the kind of corruption you're talking about. So even there, and what I would say, at least from every evidence that I have, I'm confident in the sort of weakness of any of these corruption charges against Lula, but more broadly, and I think for my purposes even more importantly, is in fact starting to make the types of distinctions between, okay, we're entering into a corrupt deal, and the upshot of that corrupt deal is generating positive benefits for the Brazilian people, which his government undoubtedly did. And I actually think, one of the really interesting challenges we have to deal with dealing with authoritarians more generally is that this very simplistic one-note anti-corruption narrative has been very inviting for the Trumps and Bolsonaros of the world, right? Now, obviously, it doesn't let the hook of the old, let the old system off of the hook either. But I think we can't just say corruption as some big blanket term, because there could be some like, okay, I'm the president of Brazil, I'll pay off some other smaller parties with, proceeds from a construction deal to vote for, providing meals to people and jobs versus, I'm going to stick that in a Swiss bank account and, skim money off the top. These are really important qualitative differences that we need to, complexify, particularly as the right uses that rhetoric to advance itself.
No, it's a great point. And, Lula, when he won in 2002, that was the fourth time he had run for president. He lost 3 previous times because of the perception that he was too radical, that he was too leftist, that he would drive away international capital. The oligarchical media in Brazil, which back then, even more so than now, had a complete monopoly on thought and information, demonized him so successfully that they made him have no chance. And then in 2002, he decided, look, I can't do anything for anybody by being ideologically pure.
Right.
I have to win in order to get into office and then start doing things for people. I'm going to start making compromises. So he wrote his famous what's called Letter to the Brazilian People, where he promised he wasn't going to bring in his radical leftism of the past into office, that he was going to be conciliatory with, the financial sector. He chose as a vice president this very kind of, I don't want to say Jeb Bush sort of figure, but like somebody just very respected among bankers and, kind of like maybe like Alan Greenspan would be a better analogy. Somebody that reassured the markets that he was not going to be this hardcore leftist leader. And then, one of the corruption scandals in his first term that actually led to some of his top aides going to prison was this vote buying scandal, where they basically, took these parties that they needed to get anything passed, who don't care about ideology and only care about money, and directed, resources to their coffers, to the party's coffers, in order to, for example, get past programs that took tens of millions of people out of poverty. And when I interview Lula, he says, I absolutely made peace with corrupt factions, with the corrupt media, because I wanted people who were waking up, who didn't have breakfast, to be able to eat breakfast and to be able to have a home. And he did all that. And I agree with you. That might be the kind of corruption that exists in the U.S., where, lobbyists write laws and senators who need their contributions approve whatever laws they want because they want to get reelected. But it's not the hardcore putting money in Swiss bank accounts, using public funds as bribes, that a lot of Brazilian politicians have clearly been guilty of and have been found guilty of with irrefutable evidence. But Lula, despite being put under the most invasive microscope, and certainly Dilma even more so, have never been shown to be involved in any of that. So I agree with you. That's a really important difference. The only caveat is that because the prosecutors haven't presented their evidence alleging these crimes. We just haven't seen what evidence they have. But I think the leak that we got, the archive that we're reporting on, and the reporting we're going to do over the next probably, I don't know, certainly months, if not, year or 2 years, is going to shed a lot of light into what they themselves thought about the case and the evidence that they have.
Yeah, so I know, Glenn, we only have a couple more minutes, but I obviously I just want to reiterate. I mean, that is my view without everybody's imperfections. I think he's 100% honest when he says that's the calculation he made. And I think that that's the context of understanding him and PT and why they're an eminently defensible project. And also because of the wins, tens of millions of people out of poverty, that's the distinction there between, say, like Democratic Party figures who maybe rhetorically will make some of the sort of same justifications, but they don't have the record to show at all the same type of accomplishments.
Exactly.
So that's a vital distinction.
Justification, but nothing
Precisely
in the way of accomplishments. I totally agree.
Exactly. So talk about Judge Morrow. This will be the last piece. He collaborated with the prosecutors. And maybe there's one other thing that isn't in the leak, but I just want you to touch on too that maybe you could include in it. One thing that gets forgotten was that there was a ruling last spring, shortly after Lula had been jailed, where a regional court judge had basically said this guy's habeas corpus had been violated. He'd accepted a petition from Lula's lawyers. He ordered Lula released immediately, and the Supreme Court later overruled him. But there was at least an hour or a couple of hours where Sergio Moro just ignored the ruling of a court and violated the law. This was another thing that happened. But maybe you could, put that together and talk about these incredible, like, play-by-play strategy sessions that the judge did with the prosecution team.
Yeah. So, I mean, the role of the judge in Brazil is not 100% identical to the role of a judge in the U.S., but it's like 98%. So unlike, say, in Italy or Spain, where prosecutors and judges are kind of merged into the same function, judges in Brazil, like Judge Moro, are required to be completely neutral. They can't plot in secret with one party or the other. Any judge that did that in the U.S., imagine a judge secretly meeting with a plaintiff or a defendant and plotting the case that they were then pretending to neutrally judge, would be immediately removed from the bench. Any judgments they issued would be nullified. This is what Judge Moro got caught doing by our reporting. And of course, people have long suspected that the head of the task force, Delton, who's about 34, 35, was taking orders all along from Judge Moro. And Delton, in his best-selling book, vehemently denied it. And then we have a video of Judge Moro where he angrily, like in this very kind of scoffing manner, says, I can't even believe when people talk about Judge Moro's prosecution theories or Judge Moro's strategy as though I'm part of the prosecution team. He said, as a judge, you learn that your value, your primary value is passivity. You don't play a role in the case. You listen to the evidence and then you neutrally and impartially make a decision. And we have years of chats on Telegram where Judge Moro is giving orders to Delton, the chief prosecutor. Why are you waiting so long to do this? You need to make this a different argument, basically constructing and designing the strategy to make sure that Lula ends up in prison and then walking into court and pretending that he's the neutral arbiter. This is something, Michael, that has turned huge numbers of people who previously revered Sergio Moro, who thought that he was like the one honest person in Brazil, into like Estadão, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Brazil. It's like kind of a center-right to right-wing newspaper that has long worshipped Lava Jato and Sergio Moro, today called on his resignation. Wow. 72 hours after we published our story. That's how extreme these chats are. And, him ignoring court orders. This is what happened. They probably began with good intentions. And this is what Lula told me in 2016, that you begin with good intentions, but once you get turned into like a superhero who was revered and are on top of every magazine, he was named part of the Time 100. He went to the gala with his wife wearing this expensive tuxedo and she in a big gown. You start to believe that you are exempt from all the rules. And that's pretty much what happened. Is the press treated him as a deity and a superhero. Nobody questioned him, nobody challenged him, and he began to believe that he was justified to do anything, including breaking the law and violating judicial ethics, in order to accomplish his end goal, which is putting Lula in prison and making sure that PT was destroyed. And that's what these documents showed that he did.
And in the last couple of minutes, what has Lava Jato's response been, and where are we? I mean, there's a new ruling coming up on Lula, and what are the prospects of freeing this guy, which is obviously a major goal of this show?
Well, the response of both Judge Morrow and the Lava Jato task force was pathetic. It was just trying to turn themselves into victims. Right. The Intercept now has our most intimate conversations and photos and videos, and including of our children and our white. And it's true, we do, but we've made clear that we intend to publish only material in the public interest, unlike what Judge Morrow did to Lula, which is intercepted his private calls and then divulged them all, including ones that were just designed to embarrass him, not ones in the public interest. We've made clear we don't intend to do that to them, but they didn't deny any of the improprieties. Judge Morrow's press conference was this very arrogant anger over the fact that anyone would even think that he has an obligation to address an accusation this tawdry. So they really don't know what to do. They're obviously petrified of what we have. There's definitely a lot of talk, mainstream talk, about the fact that Lula's conviction that was issued by a judge that everybody now knows was acting corruptly as he did it needs to be nullified. Excellent. Because it was the byproduct of injustice. There's a Supreme Court hearing in about 2 weeks, being pushed by one of the members of the Supreme Court that hates Lava Jato, that does think that they're corrupt, that has freed a lot of their prisoners. And there's a good chance that the revelations that we just made will end up reversing Lula's conviction and freeing him on the grounds that it was the byproduct of a corrupt judge and a corrupt prosecutorial team breaking every rule of basic fairness in order to put him into prison.
Well, it's amazing reporting. Obviously, I appreciate it immensely, and I think a lot of people appreciate it. I noticed in your great interview you did with Lula, I think he was a little cross with you that you didn't ask him about Venezuela, but he might forgive you as a result of this, Glenn.
I think I've earned amnesty for that.
Glenn. Now I
want to talk about Venezuela.
I want to talk about Venezuela.
You've talked about that in every interview you've done. I only have 1 hour. I have this menacing guard ready to literally just pick you up and take you away. I'm not letting you speechify about Venezuela in a way I've already heard. Sorry, I have other questions.
I don't know. My girlfriend said, "Why is Glenn not going to ask the old man about Venezuela? What's the matter with him?" So
she can find that in another. But he did it anyway at the end.
I know, it was beautiful. I'm going to ask.
Out of Venezuela.
I'm going to answer a question that you did not ask.
Exactly.
That was beautiful. And then just briefly, so people can follow all of the reporting at The Intercept. You must read this. You must share this. I think that this is obviously, for Lula, for Brazil, for democracy in Brazil, but I think Lula as a leader in this story has massive global implications. Glenn, I hope you'll come back on in a couple of weeks. There's a bunch more things that I'd love to talk with you, agree with, debate about, and also just think differently about. I think it's always just informative and fascinating for me. And also, if you don't want to say it with me, you can at least make sure I'm pronouncing it right. But I always have to end with Lula Livre.
That's pretty good. And I really appreciate how diligently and scrupulously you have followed just all events in Brazil. It's very uncommon to see, an American pundit or commentator or analyst doing that. So the work you've been doing has been fantastic and rare, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Glenn. Take care.
All right, Mike, I'll talk to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.